Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rob Petrides, and welcome to the latest Posturite webinar. Today I'm filling Catherine Metter's shoes, who normally introduces our webinars, and I must say they're pretty comfortable, although I do prefer a 6-inch heel myself, but that's maybe for another time. Anyway, one of the UK's leading consulting ergonomists, John Ridd, will lead the webinar today on the subject of investigative techniques. John serves on a number of UK and European committees concerned with workplace ergonomics, and for the past 20 years has worked as a consultant specialising in workplace design in relation to musculoskeletal disorders. Before that, John worked at the University of Surrey's Robins Institute, carrying out research, training and consultancy work. Investigative techniques, a topic on which John is supremely well qualified, having spent 20 years providing expert witness reports in cases involving musculoskeletal injuries amongst workers. So I'll now pass over to John for today's webinar. So John, it's over to you.
Okay, Rob, thanks very much for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. In today's presentation, I want to look at some of the techniques we use in ergonomics to help us identify the source of a problem, and obviously then to evaluate its magnitude and its prevalence in the worker population. The intention being, of course, that this would lead to us being able to find an effective means of reducing the size of that problem, or perhaps eliminating it completely. I shall try to illustrate these techniques and tools by reference to musculoskeletal disorders in the workplace. And essentially this is going to be the risk to the back and to the upper limb, although of course we shouldn't forget the lower limbs. Now, many of you may only have office-based workers, but others I'm sure will have factories and warehouses associated with your operation, and there will be a different musculoskeletal problem encountered in each of those environments. Hence, the particular technique that you choose, the particular tool that you want to use, needs to be appropriate to the work activity that you want to investigate. So, what might we want to investigate? Well, in order to tell whether the work activity presents a risk of musculoskeletal injury, it's necessary to understand what the risk factors might be for that type of injury. These days, I think it's well recognized that the main risk factors include awkward postures, of course, force, repetition, duration, environmental, and of course psychosocial issues. Now, posture, you don't have to be a biomechanist or a kinesiologist to be able to judge whether a posture is good or bad. A simple walkthrough of a department using your own experience and knowledge of health and safety, if that's your area, will tell you whether someone is adopting an uncomfortable or a posture which is inappropriate. Considering force, well, we need to understand whether it's appropriate for the individual who's doing it, whether it's in fact too much for them to manage, or whether indeed they might be using it might be a woman using a tool that is in fact designed for use by men, and therefore they may have to be exerting greater forces, or may not be able to handle the equipment as easily as a man might because of the size of or the design of the piece. Repetition, well, by its nature, work is repetitious, and it is something that we need to understand in terms of whether or not that repetition is reasonable for the type of work that the person is doing. Does the person have breaks? Are they able to work repetitively? Yes, perhaps at a high speed for a set level of time, but then have a break which is sufficient to allow them to recover. Duration, well, we get a lot of guidance as to how long people should be expected or can be expected to work. The HSC commonly presents a 2-hour limit for continuous work before there should be some sort of break. But they do say that that 2-hour limit is not, or that 2-hour time scale is not a limit, because depending on what the work is, you may be able to extend that. It may be the type of work in which you get inherent breaks within that work anyway, and so you get the recovery periods within the so-called continuous work. Environmental issues are important to musculoskeletal risk. Things like temperature, whether hot or cold, can affect the fatigue values or the fatigue rates that one has for different muscle groups. The space that we're working in will also affect the musculoskeletal issues, the postures that we adopt and so forth. Psychosocial issues are becoming more of a problem or more of an interest these days with respect to the risk for musculoskeletal conditions, because it does appear that things such as stress, the way in which we work, the level of communication that we have with our line management or our colleagues, the degree of support that we get from them, or the control with which we have over our work activity, all of these do impact on the stress levels and therefore the fatigue levels of the musculature, perhaps putting us at risk of a musculoskeletal disorder. So now that we know what aspects we want to look for in the workplace or work activity, we have to be clear about whether we want a quantitative or a qualitative assessment. I believe the difference between these two approaches is generally well understood, but for clarity, I would define a qualitative investigation as being directed towards the quality of the condition that we're examining. For instance, the assessor might consider the environment to provide good lighting or sufficient space, and these are qualitative terms. Whereas a quantitative investigation would require that light level to be measured with a light meter, or the workspace to be measured and then compared with British standards, perhaps, international standards or European standards. And this is just one of the standards that's available dealing with office furniture. In many assessments, there may be a need to adopt both approaches. For example, to conduct a display screen equipment assessment using the HSE's form, it's only necessary to consider whether the lighting level is suitable or not. And we can see there just above the photograph, the question is the lighting suitable? For example, not too bright or too dim to work comfortably. So that is a qualitative judgment that you have to make. The other questions on the environment there are of a qualitative nature, perhaps a subjective nature. Is there enough room to change position? Does the air feel comfortable? Are the levels of heat comfortable? Are levels of noise comfortable? So there's no actual requirement to take any measurements to do a quantitative assessment. However, if in doing that assessment you find that the light level, for instance, is unsuitable, it may be necessary to undertake a quantitative assessment and actually measure the lux levels in order that you can take that to the facilities department or the building services people to ask them to, or to give some support to your argument to make some changes. So how do we start an investigation of this type? There are many ways that we can do this, but data collection in some form is a must. First of all, we might be looking at the occupational health records. Some sort of analysis of the health or sickness absence records will be very useful. Now, whether you have access to those, of course, is another matter unless you're actually part of the occupational health team. But I'm sure a request to them to provide some guidance as to where you might have a particular hotspot of problems is certainly something that they would be able to do by analysing those records that they keep. If we're, as we must, do some observations of the work activity, then the way in which we do this can be as simple and as straightforward as a walkthrough of the area. Simply, again, using one's own experience to identify those poor postures or a bad workstation design or layout. A more quantitative observation might include time or random sampling of the activities and the events to get some idea of the frequency of activity and the duration for which it's maintained. But clearly for this you'll need appropriate checklists in order to be able to gather that data and record it and to then have it available for analysis. Another method of data collection is the interview, and this might be of experienced workers or indeed of new starters, but either way these may provide a rich vein of information. But of course the significance of any comments would need to be set against the prevalence with which such comments are made in the general workforce. There are perhaps two types of interview you might try, the structured interview and the unstructured interview. The first of these, a structured interview, follows a list of standard questions and often has a standard choice of answers. The unstructured interview allows both the interviewer and the interviewee to explore particular areas of interest in more depth. Both of these techniques have their place, but before you start with either, you have to be clear about your objective. What do you want to get out of this? Another technique is verbal protocols, an interesting technique which is in a sense similar to interviews, but with this technique the worker is asked to go through the tasks that they normally perform, but at the same time speak out loud about the actions and in particular the reasoning that they are making in undertaking that duty. This can often be very useful in identifying system failings and many of the workarounds that people inevitably use in order to be able to continue with their work. And this often raises the question in the interviewer, well, why on earth do you do it that way? And I'm sure we've all heard the answer, well, it's the way we've always done it here. And that hopefully will identify a fairly useful option that you may have for a risk reduction technique that you can implement. Questionnaires are another very good source of data collection. It's a commonly used technique, and it's a valuable technique. You can get it, if that's the right term, get at a lot of people by using this technique, but that said, there is quite often a very poor response rate, and the questionnaires are often notable for their ambiguity of the questions, and there's never the appropriate answer, in my view, that you want to give in response to those questions. But effective use of questionnaires is a useful tool, but it does require skilled design and sophisticated planning in its operation. And again, you have to be very careful about defining what you want to get out of that questionnaire. So having undertaken this initial stage, I'm getting some background noise just there, sorry. You might want to put some of this data that you've collected into one of the tools that we have available to us. But in order to do that, you'll need to have some direct measurements. Depending on the work activity, this might require the measurement of, for instance, the light levels that I've spoken of before, or of the desk size, of a conveyor speed. You might want to measure the weight or the dimensions of the loads that are going to be handled. Measurement of the back angle or the neck angle and so forth might also be important and useful. And once you have these data, it may be possible to put them into one or more of the many investigative tools that we have available to us in order to get a measure of the risk. The ones that I'm going to mention today are either from the HSE, and you'll probably be familiar with many of those, or they are those which have a reasonable track record and have been found by many workers to be useful in providing a reasonable indication of the extent of a problem. Although it would be fair to say that the scientific support for some of the criteria used not only in the non-HSE but also in the HSE tools is to some extent limited. The scientific support is not always there, but the advice that these tools produce for us is still very useful and based on good experienced knowledge. Even the HSE in L23 say that the filter is based partly on data in published scientific literature, but also partly on accumulated practical experience of assessing the risks from manual handling. So it isn't all thoroughly supported by scientific research, but it does give us a reasonable aim at what we should be looking for. So let's have a look at the risk filter just briefly. I think probably most of us, certainly if you're from the UK, will be very aware of this manual handling filter. And the idea of it is that if you're handling loads in any of those boxes which are in excess of the values presented there, then you should make a detailed risk assessment of the activity to identify whether indeed a risk does exist. Just because you've exceeded those values doesn't mean that a risk does exist. I repeat that because it is important. What you're required to do is do the assessment, and it may be that even though you're handling loads greater than those values, there is no risk, or your risk assessment might deem there is no risk because of the way in which that work is done. So it is simply a filter to get you to look more closely at the work activity. There's a similar guideline filter in HSG 60 for the upper limbs, and this filter in this document is a one-page set of questions or steps. There are 5 steps there, and these are the steps. First of all, you're required to look at the signs and symptoms which might be in the workplace, and it is suggested that obviously any medically diagnosed symptoms that you may come across are ones that you particularly take notice of. Step 2 is to consider the repetition of the activity, whether it's a high repetition rate required and whether there are suitable breaks, etc. Step 3 requires you to look at the postures, whether these are awkward in relation to the activity being undertaken. Step 4 requires you to consider the force that's applied and whether it's appropriate for that muscle group that might be involved. And step 5 is particularly interested in whether or not there is use of vibrating tools. And with those, you're expected then to answer yes or no to a number of questions within those headings. And if you answer yes to any of these steps, then what is required is that you should make a full assessment of the task, and the full assessment actually involves you going through, if you follow the HSE form that's there, it's something like an 8-page assessment form, which is comprehensive to say the least. And it's not something that the novitiate should use. You need a little bit of practice to get used to that form and what is required of you in terms of input. So if you're looking at upper limb disorders and you want something that is a little easier, then why not have a look at the ART tool from the HSE, the Assessment of Repetitive Tasks. This, I'm looking at that slide, may not appear to be particularly simple, but it is just a flow chart really, and you work through some 3 or 4 stages looking at the frequency of the task, the forces used, the awkward postures, and additional factors such as the work pace or the environmental issues. So it's looking at the same things as that risk filter was doing in HSG 60, but it is done in a manner where you're able to grade the particular risk that you're looking at in red, amber or green terms, but also to apply to those a score value. And with the upper limbs, the ART tool allows us to score those particular risk factors for either the left or the right hand, to score them differently for each hand or each arm if that's appropriate. And this at the end of the day gives you some good idea of whether you've got a preponderance of reds or ambers or whatever, and attached to that will be a certain score given, which is often quite useful when you're talking to the engineering department who love to have figures presented to them. There's a similar and flowchart and system adopted for the in the use of the MAC tool, the Manual Handling Assessment Chart. This in fact came out a few years before the ART tool, but has a similar approach with a flowchart looking at the various risk factors that you would be particularly interested in, such as load weight, of course, the distance it is held from the lower back, the point at which you started to lift that, whether it was from the floor or whether it was from waist height, whether you're twisting, and whether you have a good grip on the load, for instance, or whether there are environmental factors. So you've got all of those points in there that you categorize in terms of them being something that concerns you as an amber score, perhaps, or that you're particularly concerned by it, so you give it a red, or if you think it's okay, then you give it a green score. And these, again, produce, at the end of the day, a score for that work activity, which you can set against a scale to see whether or not you think that is something that you need to reduce or you need to improve. There is another tool, which is not the HSE. It's produced by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health in the United States, and it is the Nash Equation. And this also may look a bit frightening for you if you're not particularly algebraically minded, but it provides us with an action limit. If, as a result of working out this equation, you come up with a figure which is above that 23 kilograms that sits at the front of that list of factors, then you need to take action to reduce the manner in which, or to change the manner in which that work is done, to reduce that to the 23 kilograms. The 23 kilograms is a load which is accepted as being reasonably safe to handle if you hold it at waist level in front of your body. And so we then want to look at what is the horizontal distance actually away from the body that you do actually hold that load. What is the starting height at which you pick up the load? Is it at waist level that you're going to then lift it to shoulder level, or is it from floor level to waist level? You need to know what starting point of that lift is. Having worked that out, you then need to work out or calculate what the distance it is that you're going to move that vertically. You need to know the frequency with which you're handling that load, the asymmetry of your posture, whether you're twisted, and the degree or the quality of the coupling, the grip that you have on that load, whether you've got handholds in the load or whether you're just holding it in your fingertips. Now, the Nash equation offers you a set of tables by which you put your measured data into the tables and you come out with a factor which you then multiply against the 23 kilograms, and that gives you the situation that you have for your activity. And probably it will tell you, because you won't often have an optimal situation, it will probably tell you you've got to reduce the weight of your load to something much lower than is the 23 kilogram optimal. Ruler is a different sort of device for looking at particularly upper limb disorders. It stands for Rapid Upper Limb Assessment, and it requires the assessor to look at the positions of the upper arm, the lower arm, the wrist, the hand, and then to apply or score to this posture, which again can be put into a matrix to tell you whether or not this is an unsuitable activity. Another assessment tool which is being developed at the moment is the Pushing and Pulling Assessment Checklist, or PPAC. This is very much along the lines of ART and MAC, and has been developed to give a flowchart approach to pushing and pulling activities. And this is under development at the moment, and I believe it's likely to come out in the near future. Since the demise of the European Directive on upper limb disorders, the HSE has also decided to develop another one of these flowchart tools, I believe, called VPAC. And this is going to deal with low loads at high frequencies, which is really what the European Directive was going to be designed for, but that unfortunately was closed down a year or so ago now. Finally, I want to look at another tool which is partly designed by under the auspices of the HSE, and this is the Quick Exposure Checklist, the QEC. And this, again, a bit like ruler or many of the others, it looks at the posture of the back or the upper limbs or whatever, and grades them as to whether or not they are almost neutral or flexed or twisted and so forth. As I say, it also addresses the position of the shoulder, the arm, the hand, the wrist and the neck. But the way in which QEC differs from all of the other assessment tools that I've mentioned is that it considers the worker. It actually requires the assessor to ask the worker what they think about the job, whether or not it's excessive or they feel that they're very tired halfway through the day or at the end of the day, whether or not they have good communications with their management, and whether or not they have any control over the work activity. And by incorporating those into the assessment, you get a very rounded view of how stressful, physically and psychologically, that work activity might be. So, of all these tools, which one do you choose? Well, first of all, I think I've said this a number of times already today, be clear about your objectives. You have to know what you want to get out of this before you start plumbing for a particular assessment tool. So if you want to identify the source of a problem, well, questionnaires, interviews, and that verbal protocol that I was talking about are often the best way of going about them. If you want to quantify the problem, then obviously direct measurements are needed, but the ART tool, the MAC tool, and perhaps the NIOSH tool are going to be useful for that requirement. If you want to compare the risks that are present in different jobs, then perhaps ART or MAC or ruler are going to be appropriate in those situations. An interesting option is if you're looking at a before and after situation where you know you're going to make changes to the job and you want to compare whether or not it's going to be increasing the risk for certain aspects of health and safety. And in that situation, the QEC tool is particularly useful, I think. If you just want to assist some assistance with risk assessment, then probably something like L23 or HSD60 is the way to go forward. And I think most of us will know exactly how easy or difficult those forms are to use, and generally they are designed for the line manager and so forth to complete. And I think on that note, what I want to do is hand back to Rob to have a look at whether or not we've had any questions that we can try and address, or indeed just some of the administrative issues that I think are now up on the screen on your slides. So over to you, Rob.
Thank you very much, John. That was excellent and very informative as ever. Yeah, we have had a couple of questions that I'd like to sort of put to you now. We've had some more questions, but we will get around to answering those individually. But here's a couple of questions which I'm going to put together because they're under the same sort of heading. Firstly, what is your opinion on standing visual display workstations? And a similar question is, where I work, one employee has requested a stand-up desk. Are these something to encourage to help with back problems? So perhaps you can have a sort of shed some light on those two together.
Right. Okay. Well, it's certainly something that's very topical at the moment, and there's a lot of talk on the internet about whether sitting is the new smoking, etc., and whether we should be standing. I would have mixed, well, I do have mixed views, but generally my overriding view is that we should be trying to incorporate sit-stand desks into every workplace. Some of the problems that I've seen with them is that people don't, having been provided with them, they don't always use them. And so there is some argument, and I can be sympathetic, or I am sympathetic to a lot of employers in that they say to invest in the extra cost of these, and then people don't actually use them. Makes it very difficult for them to make the cost justification. But certainly a standing visual VDU desk is something that certainly I use as often as I can, because yes, we do get fatigue sitting in the same posture for too long. And if you are really pressed to get that piece of work out, then having a desk which enables you to raise the screens up and the keyboard, I would say. I've seen plenty of people raising the screens and still stooping over at the keyboard, but we need to raise them both, is a very good way of alleviating some of the fatigue in the back. And so sit-stand desks I am generally in favour of, but I understand entirely why they are not commonly available at the moment. One of the problems I would say with the standing desk, though, is that quite often the relationship between your eye line when you're sitting and that which you have when you're standing is different. And although you, as you should, raise the desk to the level at which you can type comfortably when you're standing, you may find that in that position your screens are a little bit too low. And that's because when we're sitting we tend to slouch a bit. But when we're standing, the spine, we don't slouch quite as much. And when we're standing up, our eye line, if we keep the screens in the same position, are sometimes a bit lower. And so some people end up with neck pain. Sorry, I'm rambling on. Rob, back to you. I hope that helps.
John, that's great. That's very kind of you. Now, if anybody didn't catch all of John's talk, although he had any technical glitches, then you'll notice that it is available after today at www.posturite.co.uk/webinars. So I'd like to thank John again. That was brilliant. I'd also like to thank all of those for registering today and listening to the talk. And please put a note in your diary for our next webinar, which will be on April 25th. And the topic will be understanding dyslexia and its impact in the workplace. So that's brilliant. So thank you all very much indeed. Goodbye.